This is still unanswered. I'm Han Ji-won. Today, we're returning to a case that has haunted South Korea for more than 3 decades. The disappearance of 5 schoolboys from a small neighborhood on the edge of Daegu in March of 1991, who became known across the country as the Frog Boys. 11 years after they vanished, their remains were found on a familiar slope of Mount Hwaryong. And yet, despite evidence of blunt trauma, signs of burial, and questions about bullets and a nearby military presence, no one was ever held accountable. Today, I want to ask, plainly, how did 5 children go out to play on a spring holiday and never come home, only to be found years later in a place their families knew well, with answers that still don't add up? Joining me to sift through the facts, the forensics, and the institutional choices that shaped this mystery is Dr. Michael Sung, a Korean-American criminologist who consults on cold cases and has worked on historic homicide reviews in both the U.S. and South Korea. Michael, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ji-won. It's an honor to be here. I'll say up front that when cases like this come across my desk, I try to keep 2 things in tension: a clinician's respect for the evidence, and always a human sense of the loss. We're talking about 5 boys, 10 to 13 years old, kids who should have been living ordinary childhoods. So I'll do my best to explain what the forensic record can and cannot tell us, and where investigative choices probably made the difference between a solvable case and the silence that followed.
That balance is exactly what we need. Our listeners will hear the facts we can verify, and I want to be direct about one thing at the start. There's a lot about this case we still can't prove. There are competing narratives: hypothermia, accidental firing, homicide, cover-up, and some of the most important questions are procedural. What did investigators do in those first hours and days? And did institutional priorities, public image, deference to military or authorities shape the investigation? So let's begin with context. Michael, take us back to Korea in 1991. What was the national mood, and why does that matter for this story?
Right. 1991 sits in a transitional moment in South Korea's modern history. The country was only a few years removed from the June democracy movement of 1987. There was a push, genuinely in some quarters, to reform institutions and to move away from the old authoritarian model. But cultural and institutional habits don't change overnight. Police culture then was still heavily hierarchical. Public relations mattered a lot. At the same time, the media was expanding rapidly. More television, more regional press looking for stories. What matters for this case is twofold. First, police were under pressure to show they could handle public safety without provoking political problems. Second, deference to state institutions like the military remained strong. That combination can tilt an investigation toward narratives that make the state look competent or innocent rather than toward messy, open inquiry.
So the day the boys disappeared, March 26, 1991, was in fact a public holiday because local elections were taking place, correct?
Yes. Local elections, the first since the end of direct military rule, were happening, which meant public attention nationally was split. For the families in that small Daegu neighborhood, that holiday meant school was out and the boys, Woo Cheol-won, Jo Ho-yeon, Kim Yeong-gyu, Kim Jong-sik, and Park Chan-in, went out together to play and look for salamander eggs, a seasonal pastime. Important detail: they lived in a clustered, semi-rural community with paddy fields, a stream, and Mount Hwaryong, a familiar hill. These were kids who knew the terrain.
They were close neighbors, basically. The parents described them as closer than brothers. Some were only children, which is heartbreaking to think about now. Early that day, one of the boys, Woo, comes back home briefly to grab a thicker jacket, a detail his father remembers. He says he's going to play outside and leaves again. Later, when Cheol-won misses his taekwondo class around 1 p.m., parents begin to worry. By evening, they report the boys missing. Michael, from an investigative perspective, how should police have handled those first hours?
The crucial window is the first 24 to 72 hours. You mobilize immediate canvassing of the last known locations and routes. You secure witnesses. You start systematic searches and preserve any potential crime scene. And critically, you treat the disappearance as possibly criminal until you can rule it out. In the Frog Boys case, multiple accounts suggest an early tendency to treat the missing children as runaways or simply late. There was that old reflex to minimize. That reflex can be fatal to a case because memories fade quickly and physical evidence can be disturbed. The first mistake, if indeed it happened, would have been underestimating urgency.
Right. And yet, what followed was paradoxical. Over the subsequent days, weeks, even months, the search became enormous. By some counts, hundreds of thousands of personnel ultimately involved. Well over 100,000 locations searched. Mount Waryong itself searched literally hundreds of times. The country mobilized. It was a national fixation. Journalist accounts mention posters, cigarette pack flyers, videotapes, 22 million flyers, a reward, fathers quitting their jobs to search the country. But despite that scale, the boys weren't found. That gap mass search, no discovery, feeds the unease. Where do we even begin to explain that?
Mass searches can be both impressive and, paradoxically, ineffective if they're poorly coordinated. Numbers sound reassuring. We searched 500,000 times. But large-scale searches without systematic methodology, without sector assignments, without good record-keeping, often produce blind spots. If teams are overlapping or simply combing the same obvious trails, other areas go unsearched. And there's another danger. Once a public narrative sets in, say that the kids ran away, search teams might be biased towards certain hypotheses. Add to that the unfortunate exploitation by charlatans, shamans who directed parents on fruitless journeys, and you have chaos more than coordinated investigation.
The shaman story is cruel in its own way. The fathers followed leads to Daegu. One even sifted through a garbage truck at a shaman's instruction. Hundreds of so-called tips, including exploitative ones from psychics. Over 500 false leads. That must have drained the families emotionally and financially. It's almost as if the national attention became another pressure on them. Hope exploited until hope runs out.
Absolutely. Families become prey to both well-meaning and opportunistic actors. And every false lead that demands time and money is a direct tax on their capacity to pursue productive leads. So the search that made headlines might have helped mobilize resources, but it also distracted, exhausted, and shifted the families away from systematic advocacy. That matters in any long investigative arc.
Okay, fast forward. September 26, 2002. Two men collecting acorns on Mount Waryong find shoes and fragments of clothing protruding from the ground. They call it in. The police excavate and recover 5 sets of skeletal remains. DNA confirms they are the missing boys. The location is roughly 2 kilometers from the boys' homes, within the larger area they were known to play. But here's the wrench. The Daegu police initially say hypothermia as the cause of death. Michael, what was the basis for that claim, and how did it square with later forensic findings?
Hypothermia was, at first, a convenient explanation, given the weather records and the way the bodies were clustered. Children huddled together could, superficially, suggest death from exposure. It also served a narrative of tragic accident rather than violence. But forensics, even with bones that had been buried for more than a decade, revealed troubling signs inconsistent with simple hypothermia. Kyungpook National University's forensic examiners reported skull fractures on at least 3 of the boys, a defensive fracture on one arm, possible bullet or pellet-related damage on a skull, charcoal and signs of a campfire, moss inside 2 skulls indicating prior burial, and clothing tied in complex knots. Those details point toward trauma and human intervention. The initial hypothermia claim, then, appears to have been premature at best and misleading at worst.
Premature is generous. Families immediately rejected the hypothermia narrative. They pointed to the boys' familiarity with the mountain. Wouldn't they have sought help? To the skull injuries, the way clothing was tied, and to bullets or casings found nearby. Then the police reclassified the case as homicide. But by that time, a decade had passed. Evidence had weathered, memories dimmed. And by 2006, the statute of limitations for murder in South Korea had expired. Let's pause there. What does a decade of burial do to forensic possibilities? Is it really impossible to determine cause of death from bones that old, as some experts later claimed?
It's complicated. Bone preserves certain types of trauma extremely well. Blunt force trauma to the skull, for instance, often leaves telltale depressions or fractures. Perimortem injuries, those that occur at or near the time of death, can sometimes be differentiated from postmortem damage based on fracture patterns, coloration, and microscopic analysis. Signs like defensive fractures on forearms are commonly visible in the long bone record. Bullets can leave distinctive entry and exit marks. Shotgun pellets might be visible as small round defects or embedded metallic fragments. Moss inside skulls is a strong indicator the bodies were buried and later exposed due to erosion. So no, it isn't categorically impossible to detect violence from decade-old remains, but the passage of time erases soft tissue evidence, complicates ballistics linking, and makes precise timelines hard to reconstruct. What's crucial is that the initial handling of remains and the promptness of the forensic exam determine how much information survives. If the scene had been better preserved in 1991, or if a murder investigation had been opened immediately, different evidence might have been recoverable.
So there's an element of loss that comes not just from the original violence, whatever it was, but from the institutional choices afterward. The decision to treat them one way, the delayed classification, the possible mishandling. That raises questions about motive. Why would police push the hypothermia narrative when there were alternative interpretations? Is it as simple as wanting to avoid scandal?
We need to be cautious about imputing motive without clear evidence. Institutions do sometimes default to face-saving explanations, especially in a period where police sought to be seen as efficient public servants and where deference to the military was common. An accidental or exposure death is politically and publicly less explosive than an alleged homicide involving bullets or potential military involvement. So there's an incentive structure, conscious or unconscious, that can favor narratives that minimize institutional culpability. But again, I'm not saying there was a coordinated conspiracy. What I'm saying is the institutional incentives and cultural deference can bias early investigative framing. And once a dominant frame takes hold, it's very hard to shift public perception even in the face of contrary evidence.
That's an important distinction. Bias and self-protection versus a neat conspiracy. But the effect is the same for the families who were left asking why their questions weren't pursued. Now, the presence of bullets and casings, this is where the military angle keeps coming back. The boys were found near an area with a military presence. There were rumors and theories about unauthorized exercises or accidental shooting. The military unit in the area officially denied any exercises that day. How do we evaluate that claim from your perspective?
It's a classic, suggestive detail. Bullets or shell casings near a burial site raise red flags. If a forensic analysis at exhumation found metallic fragments or evidence consistent with gunshot trauma, that invites investigation into nearby armed actors, including military units. Evaluating the military's claim requires documentary checks. Unit logs, weapon discharge records, duty rosters, maintenance records of ammunition, and interviews with personnel who served at that time. Those inquiries are straightforward in principle, but politically fraught in practice, especially in the early 1990s when scrutiny of military institutions was limited. If investigators didn't subpoena those records or follow the paper trail thoroughly, either because of deference or oversight, then suspicions would understandably persist. But also, not all metallic defects equal rifle bullets. Shotgun pellets, for example, produce different patterns, and post-mortem damage from tools or excavation can confound interpretation. So the presence of metallic fragments raises a question that needs rigorous ballistic and metallurgical analysis. It doesn't, by itself, prove a military involvement.
Understood. We have to hold both things true. Evidence invites questions that may never be decisively answered, and failures to investigate those questions deepen the family's suffering. Speaking of investigative failures, critics point to ignored witness testimony. There was a fourth grader who reportedly heard a horrendous scream from the mountain on the day the boys vanished, and to poor documentation of early witness statements. In 2005, the families sued the government for negligence and mishandling, and the court found no violations of law. What does that legal outcome tell us about structural accountability?
Courts are constrained by standards of proof and by the specific statutes under which claims are made. A ruling that there were no legal violations does not prove that every decision was optimal or that investigative mistakes didn't occur. It often means that prosecutors couldn't identify a specific unlawful act or that administrative routines, even if flawed, didn't cross into criminal liability. Additionally, courts are sometimes reluctant to second-guess complex operational judgments unless there is clear, provable wrongdoing. For families, that legal closure can feel like institutional denial. The takeaway: legal loss is not the same as moral exoneration. Structural failures can persist even if they aren't legally prosecutable.
And then there's the statute of limitations. At the time of the crime, the statute for murder was 15 years in South Korea, which expired in 2006. The government later abolished the statute for first-degree murder in 2015, but it was not retroactive. So, if the case had been solved after 2006 with a confession, there could be no prosecution. That seems deeply wrong to many people, and in part, because of cases like this, the law changed. Michael, how does a looming statute of limitations shape an investigation and the family's relationship to justice?
Statutes of limitations can have a chilling effect. If investigators believe there's a firm deadline, they may focus on closing the case in a way that fits within that timeline, sometimes preferring quick, tidy conclusions to protracted inquiry. For families, a ticking clock is a source of constant pressure and despair. The abolition of the statute for first-degree murder in 2015 was, in part, a response to the recognition that justice delayed should not necessarily be justice denied. The problem in this case is that the law changed too late to be helpful for these 5 boys. Repeal was symbolic and important for future victims, but it didn't make earlier failures prosecutable. So structurally, families were left in legal limbo, while the public memory of the case grew into a symbol of institutional failure.
Symbol, yes. And cultural artifact. The name Frog Boys itself grew out of a media mistake and stuck, which some families disliked because it felt trivializing. The case's cultural legacy includes films and documentaries, some criticized for dramatizing and potentially distorting facts. One film, Children, in 2011, directly drew from the case. These retellings keep the story alive, but they can also shape public perceptions in ways that diverge from evidence. Michael, how do you view the role of media and film in cases like this?
Media can be both a corrective and a distortion. Investigative journalism can force institutions to revisit evidence, pressure police to act, and keep the family's voices in public. On the other hand, sensationalized dramatizations can impose narratives that simplify complexity, invent motives, or suggest definitive conclusions where none exist. Ethically produced documentaries that foreground the families and the gaps in the investigation can be constructive. Dramatized films that monetize tragedy risk re-traumatizing victims and misleading the public. The best media work, to my mind, aids truth-finding. It encourages institutional transparency, helps collect fresh leads, sometimes people come forward after seeing a film, and it amplifies the human cost.
Let's walk slowly through the major theories listeners will have heard, label them clearly as speculation, and examine what the evidence lends support to and where it falls short. Number 1, hypothermia and accidental death. The supporting points are low temperatures, rain that afternoon, and bodies clustered together. The challenges are the skull fractures, defensive wounds, clothing tied, and possible bullet evidence. Your take.
Hypothermia can be fatal and, in some contexts, explain clustered bodies. But the presence of perimortem cranial trauma and a defensive fracture moves that explanation toward being unlikely as a sole cause. It becomes plausible only if you interpret the trauma as postmortem or explainable by a fall or accident. But the square-shaped skull fractures and the defensive forearm break are, in my view, more consistent with interpersonal violence than with accidental exposure.
Theory 2. Murder by a local adult, someone the boys knew or who worked nearby. Supporting elements: knowledge of the terrain, a blunt instrument like a hoe, the possibility of burying bodies close but off the beaten path. Weakness: no clear suspect even after massive local focus. Michael?
A local adult perpetrator is plausible, particularly in rural or semi-rural settings where a single person might have both opportunity and the knowledge to bury remains on a slope out of immediate search range. The fact that no suspect emerged despite massive local scrutiny is curious, but it's not proof against this theory. Silent communities, fear, or tacit protection can hide a perpetrator. The burial implies someone willing to stay at the site long enough to bury 5 bodies, which is logistically significant and would leave traces: footwear impressions, disturbed soil, tool marks. The question is whether those traces were preserved or even looked for in 1991.
Theory 3. Military involvement or accidental shooting during exercises. Supporting facts: metallic projectiles, proximity to military units, historical culture of military deference. Problems: no proof of military firing that day, and some forensic experts cast doubt on the idea of rifle fire. Your assessment?
This theory carries a lot of emotional weight because it implicates an institution with power and the capacity for cover-up. It's plausible in the sense that stray rounds have tragically hit civilians in other contexts. However, without ballistic matches, weapon records, or credible witness testimony pointing to military action, it remains an allegation. The investigators needed access to unit logs and personnel interviews, and if those weren't pursued fully, either because of deference or oversight, then the lack of evidence is not exculpatory. But we as investigators must distinguish rumor from verifiable forensic linkage.
Theory 4. Older youths or bullying gone wrong. Older teens attack the boys and panic, disposing of bodies. Supporting details: kids alone in the hills and speculative local delinquency. Gaps: disposing and burying 5 bodies would be a big operation likely to create rumors. Your thoughts?
It's possible. A group of older youths could harm younger children, and panic could lead to hasty burial. But 5 children is a heavy burden, literally and figuratively, to carry to a burial site. It would likely require multiple people and time, increasing the chance of witnesses. Lack of rumor or named suspects makes this less likely, though not impossible. Silence can be bought or imposed, especially in close communities.
Theory 5. Serial killer connection. Proximity in time with the Hwasong murders, etc. There's overlap in the era, but differences in geography and modus operandi. Are serial patterns consistent with what we know about the Frog Boys?
Serial offenders have particular signatures: victim type, method of approach, disposal patterns. The Frog Boys case involves a group of 5 children taken together, which is atypical for many single-perpetrator serial sexual killers who usually operate alone with singular victims. The Hwasong link was worth exploring given the era, but without stronger behavioral or forensic links, it remains a low-probability hypothesis. Again, the lack of a clear suspect or admission keeps it speculative.
Thank you. I want to shift back to the human cost now, because these theories and command failures are abstractions until we remember who these boys were. Park Chan-in's father called him extremely sincere, never gave us any trouble. Kim Yeong-gyu's parents said he was bright and cheerful. The fathers quit their jobs to search. They were publicly exposed on cigarette packs and flyers. One father was arrested in 2002 after assaulting a police officer, an act described as born of frustration and despair. Tell me, Michael, in cold case work, how often does the family's ongoing anguish become an active part of investigative work rather than just background noise?
Too often, investigators treat the families as sources or as collateral rather than as persistent stakeholders whose knowledge, persistence, and moral authority can drive the case. Families know rhythms of the community. They remember small details, and they can press for transparency in ways that other actors cannot. But families also bear the emotional toll of being re-victimized. Every public appearance, every media cycle can reopen wounds. The healthiest investigations conceptualize families as partners, keeping them informed, protecting them from exploitative media, and tapping their local knowledge while safeguarding their emotional well-being. That didn't always happen here.
Right. And families kept the skulls for years after the 2002 discovery because they hoped future forensics might yield answers. They held a joint funeral in 2004 and scattered most remains in the Nakdong River, keeping skulls as possible evidence. The memorialization continued, a monument installed on the 30th anniversary and annual services at the school. These rituals are both mourning and an insistence on memory. In your experience, how do memorials and continued public attention affect cold cases and institutional accountability?
Memorials serve multiple functions. They keep the victims visible, they create civic pressure, and they cultivate a public record that can be mobilized later. Public memory matters because it can prod institutions to reopen files, allocate resources for cold case units, or reform protocols. But memorials do not replace procedural accountability. They are a moral, cultural corrective. Institutional fixes require investigations, disclosures, and sometimes reforms to record keeping and oversight. Still, without public memory, many cold cases fade entirely.
The case was reopened in 2019 by Daegu police, in part because national attention to cold cases increased after confessions in other cases. As of mid-2020's reporting, there are no public suspects or charges. Police say investigations for truth can continue even if legal prosecution is complicated by statutes. From a technical standpoint, what could modern forensic methods still do for the Frog Boys case, if anything?
Several things could be useful. First, re-examination of any preserved samples. If metal fragments from skulls were kept, modern metallurgical testing can identify projectile types and potentially link them to weapon classes. Second, if any soft tissue or preserved biological material existed, unlikely after a decade, or if there were preserved clothing fibers, modern DNA techniques, including trace DNA, can sometimes find profiles on inanimate objects. Third, forensic isotope analysis can sometimes give information about movement or environmental signatures. Fourth, ballistic reanalysis, if casings or bullets were recovered and preserved, could link to known weapon types. Finally, investigative tools like genetic genealogy, used in some cold cases, depend on DNA profiles. Without preserved DNA, it's not applicable. So modern forensics can help, but their utility depends entirely on what was collected and preserved in 2002 and how it was cataloged.
Which brings us back to record keeping and preservation. The lack of clear chain of custody or poor documentation from the early search makes modern methods harder to apply. That's a recurring sorrow with historic cases. Small administrative steps can determine future possibilities. Michael, what would you recommend as immediate priorities for investigators if a case like this were reopened today?
First priority, catalog and inventory everything that was collected. Samples, bones, clothing, photographs, chain of custody documentation. If anything is missing, that gap itself is investigatorily meaningful. Second, re-interview surviving witnesses using contemporary cognitive interviewing techniques. Memories can be refreshed, and new corroborations sometimes surface when people are asked differently. Third, pursue institutional records, military logs, police dispatch records, and any other contemporaneous documentation. Fourth, conduct targeted forensic reanalysis on any preserved material, metallurgy, ballistic testing, trace DNA if possible. Fifth, build a robust investigative timeline that maps where each of the boys was last seen, who interacted with them that day, and what movements in the community occurred thereafter. Finally, engage the families in the process and be transparent about findings and limits.
And what about public engagement? Some fear that renewed publicity will simply reopen the wound without producing results. Others argue publicity is the only lever to force action. How do you balance those concerns?
Transparency and respectful engagement are key. Publicity can both produce witnesses and pressure institutions, but investigators should coordinate with families to ensure media strategies protect them from sensationalist intrusion. Public appeals for information should be targeted, appeal for specific facts rather than open speculation. And investigators should be prepared for the emotional fallout when details and dead ends are aired. Ideally, the policing agency should front-load resources and investigative capacity so that any publicity is followed by concrete action, not empty promises.
Let's return to some of the questions I want to leave listeners with. Open questions, because this podcast is called Still Unanswered. Why was the hypothermia explanation so persistent initially, even when forensic teams later documented skull fractures? How could a search of that magnitude miss bodies 2 kilometers from home? If the killer is alive, why have they remained silent for decades? And finally, what responsibility do journalists and filmmakers have when they dramatize unresolved tragedies that still haunt living families? Michael, any closing thoughts on those questions?
All of those are fair, weighty questions. The persistence of hypothermia as a narrative probably reflects both investigative framing bias and a desire for a less politically destabilizing explanation. The missed bodies likely reflect poor search coordination. Quantity without systematic methods yields gaps. As to why a killer might be silent for decades, it could be fear, lack of conscience, institutional protection, or simply that the perpetrator died without confessing. And regarding media responsibility, storytellers must balance public interest with ethical restraint. Avoid inventing resolution, avoid reducing victims to plot points, and center families' dignity. Finally, the broader lesson: unresolved cases like this expose the importance of institutional transparency and the moral duty to keep asking, even when answers remain elusive.
Thank you, Michael. Before we close, I want to read a short passage from a father's interview years ago. He said, "We don't want revenge. We just want the truth. Tell us why they took our 5 boys." That, more than anything, should animate the work that follows. We owe the families not only our curiosity, but our discipline. Careful questions, rigorous standards, and relentless attention to whether institutions did their jobs. If you're listening and you have information, no matter how small, contact the Daegu Police Cold Case Unit. And if you're a journalist or documentarian, ask yourself whether your work amplifies the search for truth or simply recirculates pain. Michael, any final words for our listeners?
Yes. If you're moved by this story, channel that feeling into something concrete. Support organizations that help families of the missing. Press local authorities for transparent case files. And be skeptical of neat narratives. Remember the victims as people, not headlines. And for investigators, small details matter. Paperwork matters. Preservation matters. These are the things that turn silence into possibility.
We'll keep following this story on Still Unanswered. In our next episode, we'll look at another case where early investigative choices shaped the decades that followed. And we'll talk to a legal reformer about how statutes and institutional culture interact. For today's episode, thank you, Michael Sung, for joining me. And thank you to our listeners for trusting us with this part of the story. I'm Han-ji-won. This is Still Unanswered. Soft music swells, then fades.